Hi guys, my name is Bardante, and I've painted a loaf of bread using layers. And I mean only layers. So the Photoshop would take care of rendering final colors, so I wouldn't have to do that. Now here's the final result. It's final in terms of structure, but of course I can keep on detailing it and whatever. And this is the amount of layers I used for that. Now let's quickly go through this in chronological order. I start with a loaf, and I paint this. So basic geometry of the loaf using ambient light, the values, and well, the edge of the loaf. Alpha channel that looks like this, specifying where the loaf is and where it's not. Inside of that mask, I painted this layer to define the angle of the surface of the loaf in each pixel. So this way we fully define the basic geometry. Then I threw a color on it. So right here I used overlay mode, so I would be able to colorize it not just in hue but also in brightness. And in a separate layer right here I added this burn color. Then I added sunlight. And you may notice it looks pretty dim. It's not bright enough to be sun. I could actually just make this color of the sunlight much brighter, so it may be enough to do that without getting any losses of color. But as you can see, I'm getting really weird artifacts in that case. It looks really wrong. So instead of that, I used just the normal brightness of the sunlight in a way that both ambient light and the sunlight together wouldn't be overexposing the image at all. Like we're seeing this is just in shades of gray. But then how do we make the sunlight much brighter at all? It needs to be much brighter than ambient light. There needs to be a much stronger difference. So for that, I'm using a trick of 2 exposure layers. Here's exposure -2, where I'm lowering the brightness by 2 units. Right here, just for the ambient layer, it's this low, below the sunlight and reflected light and everything else. And this way, you can see we have a very strong difference between the sun and ambient light now. I mean, it's 2 units brighter. But now overall the image is too dark. So to fix that, we apply another exposure layer that brings the exposure back 2 units to bring the image back to its initial state. And this way we get all the layers of our rendering of the loaf working together without any losses, yet keeping up the proper brightness in the end. And at this point, I think it's worth noting that I'm actually working at 16-bit mode. Because right now, if I zoom out just a little bit, you'll see an 8-bit version of this image. It would look like this. So to avoid that, you use 16-bit mode. Alright, so we have our sunlight and it's looking pretty bright, I like it. Now let's add a cool highlight from the sun right here. It's on top of the color layers because it's a reflection. Reflection is not affected by the actual color of the surface. And now we have 2 layers left. Another type of reflection, so we have sunlight separately, and then we have ambient reflection. So our ambient light in the final result is kind of bluish world like this. So I add that reflection again on top of the colors. It shouldn't be affected like this. And it's very transparent, and well, it's masked looking like that. So mostly it's just Fresnel effect on the edges. And finally, reflected light that is below the color. By the way, the order of lights, like between the lights, it doesn't really matter, and they should all be in add mode. So it doesn't matter where they are, it's important that they're underneath the color layer. And this layer looking like this, you can see a lot of the light, the ambient light, or maybe the sunlight on the floor, all of that is bouncing back at the loaf. That's why the lighting is kind of from the bottom in this case. And it's adding this rather realistic look. The only thing is I have a very strong reflected light on this side. I used to have much more sunlight on the floor in the previous version, so I'll probably go ahead and fix that right now. I'll make this ambient light a bit dimmer. So now looking a bit like this. Yeah, there you go. This is a proper light reflected from these spots. It looks just right. Now, I'm missing one extra layer for one of the physical effects of translucency, like subsurface scattering. But since this is a simple situation, meaning the bread has the same color inside as it has outside, the only difference outside is a bit darker. Contrary to humans that have really, in my case, really pale skin on the surface and bright red blood inside, then the translucency is a bit of a different story. We need a separate layer for adding that red glow of translucency. So I would be adding another color, probably on top of the color layer. I would add another layer that would be adding the translucency of the blood. So at first I'll do some translucency with just the color of the surface, since that's the first layer of translucency in any case. And as we go lower, I'll switch to actual red and expose some of that like that. So now we have a meatloaf that actually has some blood inside. Let's not do that. With a simple situation, you just soften the edges of the light itself, of the shape of the light itself, so the eye would tell that the light goes through the surface a little bit. So it's looking pretty nice, although I would say ambient light is not that great in this situation. Like, this darkness is not really reasonable in this case. So that's our loaf. Now let's go through the floor. Again, we start with the same thing, as this is just ambient light, meaning we're showing the shadow of ambient light from the loaf. Kind of like this. So then I'm adding the color, and pretty much the same thing in the same order. I'm adding sunlight like this underneath the color, making the sunlight brighter comparing to everything else, and just adding the reflection of the world that is also this pale blue color. And in this case, we can easily change the color of the surface of the floor to anything we want, while the sun will remain warm and the reflection will remain cold. So all the colors blend together appropriately. It's a full color image, and we're able to quickly change just the color of the surface, and everything else blends together in real time. One thing is, you can see I have the reflection not as a mask separate from the color itself, because the color is not a flat color for the whole world. In this case, I need a little bit of the color of the bread reflected right here, so it makes more sense like this. So the reflection looks correctly now, but now the reflection of the floor looks weird. We also need to change the ambient reflection color. So I'll just go ahead and somehow pick the color of this layer, this color, and change it in the ambient reflection and the reflected light as well, I suppose. There you go. We're now actually having a nice purple reflection, both in the reflection and the reflected light. And there you go. This method lets you kind of work with your scene almost like with a 3D renderer, where you can colorize objects and change the way they interact with each other by changing the colors of respective effects that are affecting other objects. And I can literally paint on the floor, and it will look like an actual paint physically present in this environment, while the reflection will make that color, the new yellow color, paler, and the sun will make it brighter and more like warmer. Everything's working perfectly. Same as we can go back to our loaf layer and do the same thing here. Let's make some acidic, crazy loaf. The only thing you shouldn't forget about is that even though you're painting and it's all blending together well, you need to make sure that the shapes of the colors you paint on, they need to follow the geometry. So not just the flat painting, but actually thinking through that there's foreshortening for everything going on at the edges and all kinds of stuff like that. And now finally, why I don't paint like that anymore. That's because this is the amount of layers we need for that, and if I just want to add another object that is of a different color and everything, I need to add another pile of layers like this to the scene. And I'll think about any real-world character that has an outfit, some kind of gadgets, hair with maybe something holding the hair together, all kinds of stuff. It may be like an equivalent of 50 loaves for different materials interacting with each other everywhere. So unless you're actually closing your eyes on the fact that you're not doing the physically correct lighting and you are missing out on reflected light or reflection, or just basically doing the incorrect lighting, or having a huge problem with the edges of each object, if you're not closing eyes on any of that, rendering in layers just doesn't work. There's a reason why this kind of approach is used by 3D renderers like in Blender. That's because computers don't care how much layers and how much work they need to do absolutely precisely. For us, we need the freedom of quick and easy search on just a surface, looking for familiar patterns on the image, and not just building stuff like robots. So yeah, I think it's really good to know this. This was one of my first steps on my way to learning how to really render nice lighting, like realistic colors and everything, and like more than realistic, actually manipulating things for beauty. But just keep these layers in your head while you're painting in one layer. It's so much easier in terms of brushwork, in terms of just not losing your attention while trying to figure out what the hell of a mess you have in your layers. So learn these layers, but never use them. Keep it in your head and limit the amount of layers as much as you can. I'm not completely against using layers. I'm actually planning to make another episode about where I think it's truly reasonable and only beneficial in digital art to use layers, but this is not one of those situations. Bye! Oh, also, some people will always say this is great for working with clients. If they'll tell you, change the color of the loaf a little bit, and you'll be able to just quickly change one layer and get the result perfectly fine. Like, sure, that will be useful for changing the color. But what if they'll tell you, change the shape a little bit? You will have to move all of these layers. So, you know...